Well, it's good to see everybody here today. It's a beautiful day out, isn't it? These are really neat days, aren't they? When you've had a kind of a long, dry, hot summer as it seemed to be this year. I don't know if that's just perspective or if it was actually the case, but it sure seems like the Mississippi River is low right now. It's just nice to have kind of as a break this kind of first really chilly day of fall. And it's really nice to enjoy that. Good to be here with you today. We're worshiping God and praising Him. And certainly it's our prayer that if you're a visitor with us today, and especially if it's your very first time meeting with us, we certainly hope that you're also encouraged and uplifted by our worship of God today. Let us know if you have any questions. We'd love to open up the Bible with you and talk through those things and study with you and answer those questions. You are our honored guest, and we're glad that you're here today. And we pray certainly that you have seen God in our work and our worship here at East Shelby. Well, I want to talk about the difficulties that we have in standing up for hard truths and drawing a line in the sand. Unfortunately, we do live in a world that is filled with falsehood, lies. There's persecution and troubles that come upon Christians, and the expectation that God has for us is that we will stand up for truth. That truth actually matters to the Christian. Jesus himself said in the Gospel of John, "You'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free." In chapter 14, he said of himself, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through me." Truth actually matters to Jesus. Truth actually matters to God. We have the Spirit of truth revealed to us. We have the Word of truth in the gospel. We're to be people of truth, defined by truth, and willing to be bold in how we also help to define truth for other people. Love itself is driven and defined by truth. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, that great passage on love, one of the qualities of love that Paul points out in 1 Corinthians 13 is that love does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but love rejoices in truth. And so if truth actually matters that much, then sometimes you're going to have to draw a really, really hard line in the sand when it comes to things that are truth versus things that are not truth. Jesus also took a lot of hard stands. Several points in his ministry that I want to bring out just momentarily, just real quick references here, where Jesus had to draw a line in the sand. And instead of kind of compromising or massaging his message so that it was a little bit more convenient and acceptable for other people, there are numerous times in his ministry where people called him out for something, and he would dig down further. Like he would dig his heels in even more. In John chapter 6, after this long conversation that he has about eating my flesh and drinking my blood, and people question him about that, they say, "I don't know, Jesus, that's a really hard statement that you're making." Now, a lot of people would have said, "Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be confusing. I didn't mean to kind of dig my heels in there. Let me go ahead and back off for a while on that. We'll come back to that later." No, instead, Jesus actually keeps on digging his heels in on this idea of drinking his blood and eating his flesh. He digs his heels in even more. In Matthew chapter 19, he goes in verses 1 through 9 and answers the question of, well, can a man just divorce his wife for any reason at all? And Jesus' answer is, no. You can't just divorce your wife for any reason at all. And his disciples come back and say, "I don't know, Jesus. That's a really tough line you're drawing. It kind of sounds like what you're saying means it would be better just not to marry at all. If that's what marriage is, kind of seems like it'd be better not to marry at all." And Jesus' answer is, yep. And some people have a hard time accepting this. Yeah, some people have a hard time accepting it. John chapter 9, verse 40, he heals a man who's been blind his whole life. And the whole thing is actually an allegory for learning truth, and that those who were once blind can have their eyes opened by the light of the gospel. Now, he literally does heal a man of his blindness, but in the process of that, there are some Pharisees who come up to him and say, "Well, you're not saying we're blind too, are you? Are you accusing us of being blind? And his answer essentially is, yep. Yeah. You're still blind. If you're in your sins and you're not listening to truth, you're still blind. Luke chapter 11, verse 45, some lawyers come up to him and say, you realize that in all the things that you're saying about the Pharisees, that you're actually insulting us too. And Jesus said, okay. And he rolls up his sleeves and said, all right, lawyers, let's talk a little about you then. And they get way, way more than they bargained for. Now, in all of these situations, Jesus could have responded by massaging his message a little bit, toning it down, backing off from it. But he doesn't. He doesn't. In fact, Jesus says things like in Matthew chapter 10, I didn't come to bring peace to this world, I came to bring a sword. And sometimes even your own family members are going to become your enemies because of truth. Jesus knew that his teaching would require a hard stand and would often cause conflict for people. But let's be clear about something. In all of this, Jesus wasn't just being mean or argumentative for argument's sake. That's not who Jesus was. That's not how he acted. And I'll say this as a way of commentary even on my own life and my own preaching. And I have to be very careful about this. Way too many of us justify stubbornness or mean-spiritedness with the dismissive, well, I'm just preaching the truth. And we hear that a lot. I mean, that it's almost like you can be as rude as you want to. Hey, I'm just telling you the truth. But let's remember something about the preaching of Jesus. Yes, Jesus taught truth. And yes, he would draw a hard line in the sand with some people. But there were also other times where Jesus was willing to preach the truth, but in a way that was a little easier to digest. There were times where Jesus only taught in parables, for example. And his disciples would ask him, why do you always teach why do you teach people in parables? And his answer was going all the way back to the book of Isaiah. And in Isaiah, where it says, well, they'll hear you, but they won't really hear you. They'll see you, but they won't really see you. They'll have a heart, but man, their whole heart will not understand what you're saying. And Jesus said, I don't want that to happen. So I teach in parables because teaching in parables is an easily digestible way to slip truth into people's lives almost without them even realizing it. And so, yes, Jesus would preach truth, but Jesus also knew there was a huge difference between preaching the truth and preaching the truth effectively. And I think that we don't always realize that there's a difference between those two things. Jesus spoke with authority. The last verse in Matthew chapter 7 says that the multitudes respected him and honored him because he taught as one with authority and not as their scribes and their teachers who taught in a prejudicial way and with hypocrisy. Jesus also spoke in love, which was an inarguable key ingredient to his ministry. That yes, he would speak truth, but nobody could ever accuse him of not speaking it in a loving way, even when he had to be hard. So what is this lesson really all about? What are we really talking about today when we talk about the hard edge that we have to stand on, the hard line that we have to draw about things? In matters of discipline, standing up for morality, things that are right and things that are wrong, things that are good and things that are evil, it is not always easy to be the one who has to take the hard stand. It's not always easy. In fact, I would say it's rarely, if ever, easy being the one who takes the hard stand. But there are numerous scriptures in the New Testament especially that give encouragement and guidance to God's people on how to pursue the best results, ultimately to the glory of God. So what I want to do with you is just go through some of these pertinent texts on how to stand on a hard edge, how to really take a stand on something that's true, but to do it in a really effective and useful way, and to not just be someone who just kind of digs your heels in just because, well, I'm just preaching the truth on this. Is there a way that you can preach the truth that actually makes the truth really effective, potent, and powerful in people's lives? Let's start in Matthew chapter 18. And we're going to go through a list of these passages. We only have time to offer a couple minutes of commentary on each one. So we'll let the scriptures speak for themselves for the most part, but we will offer some application as we go through them and a few final observations at the end of the lesson just to tie everything up all nice and tidy, at least hopefully, ideally. In Matthew chapter 18, Jesus makes the following statement in verses 15 through 20. Now, if your brother sins, go and reprove him in private. Right away, what do you notice? Jesus isn't saying if your brother does something you don't like, or if your brother disagrees with your opinion, or if you don't like the cut of your brother's jib. This is not talking about personal preferences here, or differences in personality. He is saying if your brother sins, and we need to be able to look in the scriptures and define what sin is. And if something's not sin by the scriptures, then it's not sin. But if something is defined as sin in the scriptures, well, you have a responsibility that if your brother is sinning, there's a process that you have to go through. If your brother sins, spread gossip about him, because nothing helps better than holy gossip. If your brother sins, make a big show out of it and make sure everybody knows what's going on before even he does. If your brother sins, well, just kind of sit there awkwardly and assume that it's someone else's job to take care of this. If your brother sins, find some way of approving of it and say, well, sin is not really sin in this case, in this context. I know it's sin for everybody else, but for you, I think you're the exception. No, if your brother sins, go and reprove him in private. I think that the reason why is make sure you got all your facts straight. Know what's actually going on, because it may just be a misunderstanding. You may think your brother is sinning, but when you get all the facts straight from the source, you go, oh, man, I completely misunderstood what was going on. I was totally misreading this situation. I'm sure glad I talked to you first before I went and gabbed about it to somebody else or tattled on you to someone else. Now, if he listens to you, you've won your brother. End of story. Great. You had a hard conversation, you stood up for something that was true, and your brother recognized that. End of story. You've won your brother. But that's not always how it is. It's not always that tidy. But if he does not listen to you, take one or two more with you. And again, notice what Jesus is not saying. Jesus is not saying, well, you did your best and you tried. Just give up. He's saying there's a next step to this. There's a level of pursuit that you have to have with your brother. Why? Because you care about him. And he's sinning, and he might go to hell. And so take two or three with you so that by the mouth of two or three witnesses, every fact may be confirmed. Now, if he even refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And only then does this escalate. And notice there is an escalation of engagement throughout this process. What starts with one-on-one, let's get the facts straight and have a private conversation, turns to, well, I've talked about it with some other folks, and these two or three folks also agree with me that this is a serious issue that we need to resolve, and I hope that you'll listen to us. And then and only then does it escalate beyond that to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile. And other translations may say to you as an outsider, an outcast, or even as a tax gatherer. Let him be regarded as a sinner. If he's unrepentant, then that's sin. So there's a very logical and also loving order to this. I guess the challenge is, do you actually practice it? I think Matthew chapter 18 is one of those undeniable, inarguable passages when it comes to our relationships with each other in dealing with and resolving sin. We know what it says. Are we actually doing it? Similarly, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and I'll summarize a little bit here. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, beginning in the first verse, Paul addresses the church at Corinth with an issue that he has heard about and he knows to be true. He says, I have heard that there is a situation in your own congregation that you've just swept under the rug and you've ignored. That there is a man who has a romantic relationship with his father's wife. What he means by that is his own stepmother. That there's a man in a romantic relationship with his stepmother. Now, what have you done about that? What have you done to resolve this? Because you know that's not right. You know that that's an inappropriate, unlawful relationship, that is an immoral relationship. What have you done about it? He tells the Corinthians, you've done nothing. You sat on your hands. You swept it under the rug. Maybe with an awkward smile on your face, you said, they do make a cute couple, I suppose. Now, don't we do that when it comes to sin? Sin is always, in hypothetical terms, right? As long as it's someone else's family or someone else's church or a sin that's happening on the other side of the world, it's very easy to define sin for us because it has no practical impact. But then suddenly, the sin happens in our own family. Or it happens to that brother or sister in the church who you see every Sunday and every Wednesday with a smile on your face, and you don't know how to approach it now because it's really hit home. And Paul warns the Corinthians in this passage, it hit home and you did nothing. And what's happened is it's a little bit of leaven, a little pinch of yeast in the lump of dough. And what does a pinch of yeast do to a lump of dough? It impacts the whole thing. One little bit of yeast causes the entire lump of dough to rise and expand. It impacts everybody. So his prescription at the end of the chapter is there needs to be a division here. You can't just continue going on ignoring what someone has done as far as sin is concerned. You have a responsibility to not associate with a brother or sister who's in sin. Now, he says in verse 11 of the chapter, as we kind of bring that chapter to a close, I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother if he should be an immoral person, or covetous, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or a swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? You don't judge those, or do you not judge those who are within the church? The responsibility is, I can't stop everybody out in the world from sinning. People are going to sin. That's what the world is. I can't stop everybody. But can I put a focus at least on my brothers and sisters in the church? And do everything that I can to help them understand what is right and what is wrong. And by sweeping sin under the rug in our own congregation, what we do is we essentially approve of sin. And it becomes the yeast in the lump of dough. Remove the wicked man from among yourselves, verse 13 says. He's quoting from the Old Testament there, Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 7. Now, presumably, or possibly, and there's differences in commentators on this, and that's fine, but possibly in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, you actually have kind of a follow-up to this, that the man who needed to be disciplined by the church in 1 Corinthians 5 has now been disciplined. And Paul kind of follows up here in 2 Corinthians 2 as all right, now let's get back to this. Let's see, what's the second part of this? You've disciplined him. And he says here in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, beginning in verse 5, if any has caused you sorrow, he's caused sorrow not to me, but in some degree, in order not to say too much to all of you. When one person commits sin, it hurts everybody. One sin hurts us all. We're all impacted by it. Now he says in verse 6, sufficient for such a one is the punishment that was inflicted by the majority. It was sufficient. It was what needed to happen. The leaven needed to be removed. The sinful influence needed to be cut off. And it happened, and he said it was sufficient. But in verse 7, here's the other side now. Here's part 2 to this. Lest you think Paul's just being cruel for cruelty's sake, so that on the contrary, he says in verse 7, you should now forgive and comfort him, lest somehow such a one be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. Wherefore I urge you to reaffirm your love for him. The point of discipline, whether it's discipline in a church or discipline in a workplace or discipline of our children who we love so very, very much, the point of the discipline is not to overwhelm someone with guilt and just tear them down until they've fallen apart in little tiny pieces and they're dug under your heel. That's not the point of discipline. The point, as Paul says, is to reaffirm your love for somebody, to realize that the punishment was sufficient and you don't need to keep driving them into the ground. Tell them how much you love them. Don't let them be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow, but to be overwhelmed with the excessive love of their church family. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, go a little bit further in the New Testament here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Just a couple verses, a shorter reference here, but I like some of the language that he uses. In 1 Thessalonians 5 and verses 14 and 15, he says, "Now we urge you, brethren, admonish the unruly," right? That's the idea of when someone's causing trouble, when someone's being divisive, when someone's spending all their time doing nothing but mischief in a church family, you got to admonish them. Encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with all men. Verse 15, "See that no one repays another with evil for evil, but always seek after that which is good for one another and for all men." I think there's a connection there in verses 14 and 15, that what you do in verse 14 is a fulfillment of the command in verse 15 to seek what is good for one another and for all men. And so the implication, and it's not a stretch, by the way, but the implication then is that admonishing the unruly is part of seeking what is good for one another and for all men. Admonishing the unruly is a good thing. And it is good for you, it is good for a church, it is good for everybody. A couple other passages here. 1 Timothy, go to 1 Timothy chapter 1. And I want you to notice something here in the next three passages from 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. I want you to notice the escalation here, okay? And I think it's very obvious, really, when you kind of point it out. But in 1 Thessalonians, there's language that's used of, it's kind of lower commitment, it's kind of easier to digest. 2 Timothy, he raises the level up. He escalates it by saying, okay, all right, you got to use a little bit more caution here. And by the time you get to Titus, which will be our third passage here, there's a very clear line of division. And I think what he's saying here is that over time, you have an opportunity to patiently work your way through this process. That it may start here with this very loving, very patient, that moves on to, you got to draw a line now, that eventually, if it has to, leads to even alienation and cutting off in your relationships with people. 1 Timothy chapter 1 starts here in verse 3. He's urged to instruct certain men not to teach strange doctrines. Highlight that word, instruct, okay? Instruct certain men not to teach strange doctrines, right? That's patience, it's going through it, it's opening up your Bibles, it's answering questions, it's a conversation, right? Instructing people. And he says the goal of our instruction in verse 5, the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. So that's kind of how it starts is, when you're confronted with a brother or sister who's teaching something or practicing something that doesn't appear to be right, the first step is, let's talk about this. Let's instruct. Let's just teach. And the goal of our instruction in verse 5 is love from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. Like, that's, if I ever hear you say something weird in a Bible class, my goal from square one is, well, let's just talk about this. Let's go through this. Let's open up the scriptures and let's talk through it. That's my goal. That should be your goal. Let's instruct each other. If one of us is wrong, or one of us needs to learn something, or one of us needs to be more nuanced about it, let's instruct each other and talk through this. That's kind of step one. But then he comes back in 2 Timothy. And I imagine talking about probably some of the same people, right? These people who are teaching strange doctrines. Some of these same people, now he comes back in 2 Timothy and makes the following statement in 2 Timothy chapter 2. Now, in 2 Timothy 2 verse 14, remind them of these things and solemnly charge them. I think instruction from love is step one. But solemnly charge there's an increased level of seriousness in that language, isn't there? From, instruct them in love to solemnly charge them. Like there's a seriousness there in the solemnly, and then it's a command, solemnly charge them. Like the time for a casual conversation is over. Now it is time for solemnly charge them. In the presence of God, not to wrangle about words, which is useless and leads to the ruin of the hearers. Be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, handling accurately the word of truth. But avoid, he uses the word avoid, right? Again, there's an increased level of seriousness, an escalation in all of this. Avoid, he says, the worldly and empty chatter because it leads to further ungodliness. But then there's a third passage. And you go to Titus chapter 3, and I think we've escalated up to that next level. It's not instruct from love. It's not solemnly charge them and avoid. Now we've reached this third level in Titus chapter 3 and verse 9. But shun foolish controversies and genealogies and strife and disputes about the law. They're unprofitable and worthless. Reject a factious man after a first and second warning, knowing that such a man is perverted and is sinning, being self-condemned. So you see the instruction from love in 1 Timothy, and then it escalates up to solemnly charge them and avoid in 2 Timothy to refuse or shun and reject in Titus 3. Now, the point I want to get at here, and I think this is a very practical thing to consider. I don't know exactly, and the commentaries on 1st, 2nd Timothy and Titus, different answers, various answers, you don't really know. But the timeline from 1st Timothy to Titus may have been a few years. And so this process isn't something that happens like today. Like if I hear you say something weird in a Bible class and I come up and say, listen, you have 24 hours to change your mind on that. This process that you see played out that Paul is encouraging Timothy and Titus to practice, maybe a years-long process of study and then meditate on it. Then come back and let's study again. Then we meditate on it. Then we maybe look at it from a different angle. Then maybe we get someone else involved. Then maybe we leave you alone for a while and you go and study that and then come back in 6 months and let's hit this again. This process may take a long time, but don't be confused. The process has to happen. I mean, whether the process happens in a week, 7 days, or 7 years, don't let the process just get swept under the rug. Because I think what happens is we get into a pattern when we disagree with brothers or we see them in sin, we have to take a hard stand. We kind of get into this pattern of, well, you know, I'm just studying that. I'm just studying that. I have known people who have been just studying something for 20 years. And like at some point, I don't know how long this takes. I'm not going to make that determination for you. But at some point you go like, there's only so many Bible verses on this topic. Like at some point you're done studying. And I've known people, including preachers, they take 20 years, 30 years. Well, I'm still kind of studying them. The Bible says what it says. At some point you got to make a decision about something. At some point you got to know what the Bible says and make a determination. And that doesn't have to take 20 years. But let's be clear. The process does have to happen. Now, we already read 2 John verses 9 through 11. I want to just go through just 3 quick hits here as we bring our lesson to a close. Just some final observations, some things to think about in this process of having to take a hard stand on something. I think church discipline and family discipline have a lot of overlap between them. Our kids, just like our brothers and sisters in a church family, need to know where we stand on things. They may not always like it, they may not always agree with it, but I do think there is a refreshing clarity that comes from being honest in the subject of discipline. Hebrews chapter 12, in this great passage on discipline in verses 7 through 11, he mentions there that our Heavenly Father disciplines us the way an earthly father disciplines his kids. And he says, we respected our fathers for that. They disciplined as seemed best to them, and we respected them for it because I may not have always liked what my dad said. I might not have always agreed with what my dad said. And as a father myself, maybe I choose to do two things different than my father did when he was raising me. But one thing I cannot deny is I respected my father for it. I didn't always like it, didn't always agree, but I respected my father because I knew where he stood on something. I knew what the curfew was. I knew what his take was on, are we a drinking family or a not drinking family? I knew what his take was when it came to, what's your commitment level when it comes to studying, praying, worshiping? Commitment to a church, commitment to a family, commitment to God. I didn't always understand it at the time. I didn't always like it at the time. But I respected my father because I knew where he stood on something. And the same can be true in a church. We might not always understand why we come to a conclusion that we do, why our elders make a decision that they make, why Ryan preaches the way that he preaches on something. We might not always understand or agree at the outset of that, but I do think there's something refreshing in a world full of mealy-mouthed, just kind of mealy-mouthed people who don't ever want to commit to anything. I think there's a refreshing clarity that comes with saying, listen, we disagree on this. This is where I stand on this, and that's where you stand on this. And at least we know what we think about it. At least we know where we're starting from. We know where we're starting from in this conversation or in this Bible study. And I think that could be very, very refreshing. The same is true of taking a moral stand in our community or among our peers at work or in school. Jesus reminded us in Matthew chapter 5 that salt that is not salty is good for nothing. You have to stand out. That's part of being a Christian. Nobody lights a lamp and then puts a basket on top of it and hides it in the closet. Salt that's not salty is worthless to God. A light that is hidden under a basket is useless for lighting the way for anybody. And I know that it's inconvenient and can be very painful and can be very alienating to be the one person in a community or in a workplace or in a school that draws a line in the sand and stands up for something. It can be very hard. And they'll hate you for it. But if we love people, then maybe, just maybe, that line that we draw might be just enough light to open up the eyes of someone who's lost. And the last point I'll say is really, really an important one. That's why I'm ending on this one. Let's show grace in our disagreement. Because we all, every one of us, remembers a time in our lives when we had misplaced convictions, where we were just absolutely certain that we were right about something. And then 20 years later, you look back on it and go, oh, I wouldn't preach that sermon again. And I've been preaching for 20 years now. And there's lessons that I did 20 years ago, I wouldn't even dust them off at this point. You know why? Because we're all learning and we're all growing. And we all, if we love the truth and we're pursuing the truth, we will all have a receptivity and an openness to that truth, whether that truth comes when you're 12 years old or 40 years old or 80 years old. As long as we're receptive to truth, we will always be willing to listen and understand and apply. And so let's have some grace when we disagree. Let's have some grace when we see someone and assume they're sinning or think they're sinning. Let's have some grace in how we interact with each other. Where's your heart in all of this? Because I'll tell you what, God, in His grace and patience, God can correct bad ideas. God can correct bad doctrines. God can even help correct bad behavior. But it's a much bigger challenge to correct a bad heart. Now, if you're not a Christian here on this beautiful day, this is your opportunity to make things right with God. Obey the gospel message, which in its simplicity reaches out to you from the pages of the Word. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. He who does not believe shall be condemned. And in a lot of ways, my friends, it really is that simple. Now, there's more to it, living the Christian life, and I get that. But to take that first step of obedience to God in faith and to accept the grace that's being offered to you really is that accessible to you today, right here and right now. So whatever needs you might have, please let it be known by coming forward as we stand and sing.